Okay, so you can see from what we said on life, how Wordsworth's idea of poetry as an expression of feeling without reference to words is taken up by Shelley, and the radical consequences of this shift are played out, because that is what is happening here. I think Wordsworth's initial error of language, of precision in language, is picked up by Shelley, and he runs with it. But truthfully, even in Wordsworth's own poetry, it's hard to see a person there. It is a mind, a feeling mind that apprehends the world around him, and does so in terms of what Keats is going to call the greeting of the spirit. He loves what's around him, it influences him, he's delighted by it, but there's no personal interactions. There are very few conversations, there's no romantic attachments, there's no action in terms of interaction of persons on stage. There's no drama written this period by the Romantics. They write closet dramas, they write about internal activities, but there's no external actions. What we just looked at from Byron's Manfred is largely an internal closet drama. Shelley does it even more so, a little bit more consistent, which is why he's a little bit less easy to read, actually. Becomes incoherent. If you don't have a sense of a distinct personhood in the individuals there, it's really hard to follow. It's all just modifications of the one mind, so it's internal thoughts going on inside your head. Like, how do you describe that in a coherent way for other people? But they don't do drama for this reason. The Romantic poets do not delve into drama. So when he comes to On Love, it's going to be a reflection of his view of human life already. And it will be more an expression of desire. What is love? Ask him who lives. What is life? Ask him who adores. What is God? I know not the internal constitution of other men, nor even thine, whom I now address. I see that in some external attributes they resemble me, but when, misled by that appearance, I have thought to appeal to something in common and unburthen my inmost soul to them, I have found that my language misunderstood like one in a distant and savage land. The more opportunities they've afforded me for experience, the wider has appeared the interval between us, and to a greater distance have the points of sympathy been withdrawn. I have everywhere sought sympathy and have found only repulse and disappointment. He sounds like Frankenstein's monster. There's no soulmate out there for me. Thou demandest what is love. Now he just gives the definition. It is that powerful attraction towards all that we conceive or fear or hope beyond ourselves, when we find within our thoughts the chasm of an insufficient void and seek to awaken in all things that are a community with what we experience within ourselves. So in other words, because that's not clear and straightforward, I don't think, in my narcissistic understanding of myself, the void I see within myself, I try and fill from external objects, I try and plug that void. That's what love is me using you to plug a void within myself. Is that unfair? Is that roughly in the right direction? Whatever is lacking in me. Augustine will say that you made it, Lord, you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. So there is a void in us which longs for completion or marriage or something that will be appropriate to our being. We're not made to be alone, like Adam in the garden. Right? There's a longing outside of ourselves for something, and that something is actually ultimately, according to Augustine, only met in God himself. He's the true object of all desires. And all the earthly desires can be calibrated in accordance with that ultimate goal of our souls. Jesus is the lover of our souls, There are legitimate forms of expression of that love in this life, which Lewis talks about in the Four Loves and so forth. So marital life and so forth. It's not wrong to love your wife. However, you shouldn't love your wife more than God, as Adam did. Some of the church fathers think that that was Adam's mistake, is that he loved his wife more than he loved God. Who knows? But it's a mistake of love. It's also a clear transgression of a clear commandment and so forth. But they're saying he didn't misunderstand God. He just loved his wife more than he loved God in that situation. So he's misled by her. Milton sort of leans in that direction as well. Fondly overcome by female charm, he says. But there's a void within us, and we fill that void, and that's what the love is the attempt to fill something that's lacking in us. And if we reason, remember this is the autonomous self speaking on his part. He thinks that he has to define love. He's not appealing to what Christians have said or what Plato says. He's coming up with his own definition based on his perception. If we reason, we would be understood. If we imagine, we would that the airy children of our brain were born anew within another's. If we feel, we would that another's nerves would vibrate to our own, that the beams of their eyes would kindle at once and mix and melt into our own, that lips of motionless ice should not reply to lips quivering and burning with the heart's best blood. This is love. He can write. This is the bond and the sanction that connects not only man with man, but with everything which exists. Okay. Doesn't mean it in an erotic sense. He means it in the fulsome sense that Christians will talk about love. So Lewis will talk about storge love, familiar love. We love our favorite armchair. We love certain types of food. That it is a sort of a love. So that's what he means. There's nothing corrupt about this. But he's just saying I mean something very expansive here. There is something within us from the instant that we live, more and more thirst after its likeness. So very good. You ought to bring in the God in whose image you're made then at that point. But for likeness, if you reject God, then you seek God in all things. And hence the panentheism characteristic of the Romantic period. They do find God in literally in everything. But they don't direct that sense and give praise to God for it. They give praise to what the supernatural in nature, which is a misdirected perception of a transcendence. If they attributed it to God, it would be rightly perceived. But we dimly see within our intellectual nature a miniature, as it were, of our entire self, yet deprived of all that we condemn or despise. The ideal prototype of everything excellent or lovely that we are capable of conceiving as belonging to the nature of man. So again, you get a general gist of it, and I think this one is less significant. But love then is postulated on his view of what life is, and life is already rendered indistinguishable, or human life is indistinguishable from all other forms of life. And so love likewise. So he is, in a sense, you could say he's an idealist. I just think he destroys categories that are necessary to rational thought. And so he verges into obscurity as much as anything. Do you have any comments or questions, observations, anything about Mr. Shelley here? I think the essay on life is particularly important. Yes? It seems to have it does seem to have the stamp of Gnosticism on it. Insofar as the Gnostics, I mean, I think there are differences as well, but insofar as the Gnostics see that the soul is, we are souls, and our bodies are not us. They're prison houses for the soul. And therefore we seek, what we do with our bodies doesn't really matter. So in the proto-Gnosticism that is referred to in Corinthians, people who are married no longer have marital relations. They act because their souls, they find their perfection in a spiritual fashion. They can ignore their bodies and not procreate any longer. On the other hand, same mistaken understanding, there are those who have sexual relations with their mother-in-law. And he says, not even the pagans do this. But why do they do that? Because they say we're spiritual beings, so it doesn't matter what we do with our bodies, because we're going to get a resurrected life, and the body is not who I am. Jesus has raised my spirit, but it's not, my body is dissociated from that. I've been spiritually renewed, but it's got nothing to do with my body. And they're neglecting the significance of the incarnation and the physical death of Christ and the physical resurrection of Christ, which is talked about at length in 1 Corinthians 15. Like that the bodily resurrection is a key Christian doctrine. You can't neglect it, but they are neglecting it. Their bodies don't matter. In Romans 12, he says, offer up your bodies as a living sacrifice, for this is your spiritual act of worship, right? So your bodies are part of your spiritual act. So again, all these things are filling in the Imago Dei a little bit as well then, right? But note that the spirit directs the body, but the body's still part of you. Whereas the Gnostics say, no, it's not. And Shelley likewise is saying that the personal distinctions don't matter. I don't think he's going against the body so much as a spiritual distinction of personhood, which is even more deeply rooted, that it's a worse form than Gnosticism. Saying the grammar is just, this is conventions. We're used to using grammar, but really, that's just convention. That's not the real thing. The real thing is the loving presence within what we call a distinct human being. The I, you, they, as he says. Those are just grammatical assemblages of thought that are modifications of the one mind. We're all one. Now, when we say that rhetorically, we're all one. He literally means we're all one. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it sounds very positive because we're getting rid of barriers. We're radically inclusive. It seems to neglect the personal autonomy of the other individuals, as far as I'm concerned. If you want to use his terms, personal autonomy anyway. So, other comments or questions? Yeah, it does lean in Gnosticism, and I think the 19th century is marked by a return of Gnosticism, and it's expressed in the Geist des Wissenschaften, which I've said repeatedly, the so-called spiritual sciences of the German university that throws out theology, rooted in the Word, and starts to come up with a view of human nature that we define. What is a human being? Well, we know what a human being is. We define what a human being is. And then we see a history of humanity, which we ourselves will trace, and then posit how we got from the past to the present moment. But we're seeing it from the God's eye perspective of the present, looking downwards into the deep, dark past. And it began in grunts and cries from those savages, the Neanderthals, who then became more and more sophisticated and developed over the course of time. And so that's anthropology, the study of man, the anthropos, the science of man, which again makes no reference to theological definitions of what human nature is. And quite frankly, the study of anthropology veers very quickly into evolution, because the study of man, anthropology, actually is just a subset of the larger category of the study of life, which begins in the primal ooze of the amoeba and so forth, and it just develops and specializes, etc. So once you've got rid of, so anthropology is no longer the study of man at all, it's the study of life, just like Shelley. And it's done in the name of a scientific inquiry, which when I studied the scientific method or was taught the scientific method in high school, I was told that I had to make sure that it was objective, and that meant I had to be unbiased in the experiment. Right? I couldn't come, I would just observe, I would not be prejudiced, I wouldn't bring any biases to the experiment, I would just look and then observe, and if I could repeat that, then it was a valid experiment. The problem is if I'm studying what a human being is, and I am a human being, I'm biased in the study. So the anthropology is already rooted in an enormous bias, which claims to be objective furthermore, but that's just, for me, this is just propaganda. Anyway, let me get going on this. This work, Defense of Poetry, was written in 1821. It was a response to an essay written by Shelley's friend Thomas Love Peacock, a rather, I think, tongue-in-cheek essay called The Four Ages of Poetry, in which Peacock argues that poetry is now surplus to requirements in our day. Science has obliterated the need for poetry. We don't need poetry anymore. We've got science, we have technology. Why bother with poetry? Because poetry is useless. It talks about our feelings, but science. Peacock might be thought to be presenting a position that our contemporaries would hold to be true. What he does certainly, and probably genuinely holds, is that poetry is of less use to us than it used to be. And the proof of that would probably be just the study of Western education. Homer was the teacher of all the Greeks, so clearly the poets in the educational structure of the Greek world, it didn't change in the Roman world. They, again, would have appealed to the greatness of the poets. The Romans did not move away from the Greeks and their belief in the great works like that of Homer, and Virgil wrote his epic for that reason. Christians would do something of the same sort of thing when they would exalt the Bible. They're exalting a word, the Word. The Word is the center of their culture. So here we have an attack of science divorced from the Word, on the Word. And whether he intends it seriously or not, I think there is a serious charge that was made in the 19th century and continues to be made. It's not the battle of the books of Swift. It's more of the what do they call this? It's not the two solitudes, but it's the I've forgotten the name of this. C.P. Snow. There's a title for an essay. Anyway, it's how the sciences are really at war with the humanities, which I think we still think. And that the STEM subjects have replaced and the humanities as the central human interest and the means of employment and the means of humanizing ourselves and looking and creating a better world. We will study the sciences and we will forget about the humanities. Very popular position in our day. So this is an attempted rebuttal of that. It was supposed to be published in a literary magazine called the Miscellany, but that journal folded, and so it was never published until 1840 after Shelley was dead. Mary published it. So when I say Shelley had no influence, even this, his greatest essay, was not influential in his day. It's not Shelley's fault. But 18 years after he wrote it, it finally gets published. What's interesting about it is that he argues, and this seems to be moving away from Wordsworth, he says that poetry is mimetic. So it is mimesis. It's a representation of reality. So he's not going against the mimetic tradition. But note again, when he comes to a defense of poetry, he's immediately going to classes of mental action. It's very Cartesian of him. He's not talking about a type of language. When Coleridge talked about poetry, he was getting into issues about whether poetry is defined by meter and things like that. And actually he said that really the basic definition of poetry is metrical language. When Shelley talks about poetry, he's not talking about language, he's talking about mental action. Just like Blake, just like Wordsworth. So there's a I would say a strong congruity between all the Romantics except for Coleridge. Coleridge is in disagreement with them on fundamental things. But there are two classes of mental action which are called reason and imagination. But note, I'm going to talk about poetry. I'm not going to talk about language. I'm going to talk about the mental action that gives rise to it. And reason is its opposite. Okay, so what is reason? The mind contemplating the relations borne by one thought to another, however produced. And the latter, that is the imagination, as mind acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own light, and composing from them as from elements other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of its own integrity. So if you want to, you can see his definition of the imagination as the secondary imagination, because that's what the secondary imagination does. It colors them with its own light. It changes. But note that for Coleridge, that was predicated on the primary imagination. And the primary imagination was rooted in the divine I am. What does he say? It's a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. That's the primary imagination. And the second is like it, and only different in its mode. And what does it do? Well, it takes it apart, puts it back together, colors it, and so forth. But it's grounded in the primary imagination. And the primary imagination is connected with the creative fiat and with the declaration of God, who God is to Moses in the burning bush. That's what he's rooting it in. So he's trying to pull it towards something that we would say is real. And therefore the poet's reflections are rooted in that and can't depart from it furthermore. If this is primary and secondary is built on that, then the secondary has sort of guidelines that it can't part away from. Shelley's imagination, as we've already seen, has no boundaries whatsoever. He would include the imagination that the Renaissance would call madness. But he doesn't speak of the primary imagination. He speaks of a different mode of mental action, being that of reason, thoughts related to each other. Now, Coleridge said that the best forms of human language are related to the thoughts, the relations of the mind to one another, which are expressed in symbols and so forth. That's the best part of human language. But it's not reason, it's the best part of human language. So if you really want to talk about the best part, then it is when we talk about those interesting things. But it's not a separate component of thought. And what Shelley does here is, again, I can't, it's just too big. He is going to disparage reasoning in this process, because what reasoning will do is it will separate things, and what the imagination will do is reunify them. Here's where it says this. The one is Okay, this is where the internet fails us. It's the Greek word here. Where is this? Prose, defensive poetry. The one is, what does it say? Topoieng, or the principle of synthesis. Poiesis is to create. Topoieng, or the principle of synthesis, and has for its objects those forms which are common to universal nature and existence itself. The other is the to logodzane, or the principle of analysis. So one is synthesis, the other is analysis. Reason analyzes, that is, it breaks apart into its small atomistic parts. The other is the synthesizing power that brings everything together. Note that he's speaking in terms that are, you can compare to Coleridge, but there's also clear blue water between the two men here. Or the tautologizane, or the principle of analysis, and its action regards the relations of things simply as relations, considering thoughts not in their integral unity, but as the algebraical representations which conduct to certain general results. Reason is the enumeration of qualities already known. Imagination is the perception of the value of those quantities, both separately and as a whole. Reason respects the differences, and imagination the similitudes of things. Reason is to imagination as the instrument to the agent, as the body to the spirit, as the shadow to the substance. In other words, we're leaving the age of reason. It's a type, and now we'll come to the antitype. Well, the fulfillment is there in the imagination. The imagination is a faculty that should replace the rational, the appeal of reason, of the age of reason. Poetry, in a general sense, may be defined as an expression of the imagination. And poetry is connate with the origin of man. Okay, now he's referring to human nature. All right. Man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are driven. Sees himself as a passive instrument. Like the alternations of an ever-changing wind over an aeolian lyre, which move it by their motion to ever-changing melody. So here it's a passive thing, and the imagination is moved by it in that sense. We already looked at that. But there is a principle within the human being, and perhaps within all sentient beings, which acts otherwise than in the lyre, and produces not melody alone, but harmony, by an internal adjustment of the sounds or motions thus excited to the impressions which excite them. It is as if the lyre could accommodate its chords to the motions of that which strikes them, in a determined proportion of sound, even as the musician can accommodate his voice to the sound of the lyre. A child at play by itself will express its delight by its voice and motions, and every inflection of tone and grammar, every tone and every gesture will bear exact relation to a corresponding antitype in the pleasurable impressions which awakened it. It will be the reflected image of that impression. And as the lyre trembles and sounds after the wind has died away, so the child seeks, by prolonging in its voice and motions the duration of the effect, to prolong also a consciousness of the cause. In relation to the objects which delight a child, these expressions are what poetry is to higher objects. The savage, now this is interesting, and here's the beginning of anthropology, in this observation right here, the savage, for the savage is to ages what the child is to years, expresses the emotions produced in him by surrounding objects in a similar manner. And language and gesture, together with plastic or pictorial imitation, become the image of the combined effect of those objects and of his apprehension of them. So this, in the savage world, he is making the associations of feeling which come natural to him and immediate to him and powerfully, just like children do. So they're watching something, they are moved by it, and they're swaying and they're cooing or singing, and they're modulating their voice to the way they feel about what they're singing around. They're singing a song, it might not even be a tune, but they're just approximating it in their voice. And that's what savage poetry is like. And it's an expression of primal feelings. And then he goes on, man in society, now this is the later development, with all his passions and his pleasures, next becomes the object of the passions and pleasures of man. An additional class of emotions produces an augmented treasure of expressions, and language, gesture, and the imitative arts become at once the representation and the medium, the pencil and the picture, the chisel and the statue, the chord and the harmony. The social sympathies of those laws from which are from its elements society results begin to develop themselves from the moment that two human beings coexist. The future is contained within the present as the plant within the seed. And equality, diversity, unity, contrast, mutual dependence become the principles alone capable of affording the motives according to which the will of a social being is determined to action, inasmuch as he is social. And constitute pleasure in sensation, virtue in sentiment, beauty in art, truth in reasoning, and love in the intercourse of kind. Hence men, even in the infancy of society, observe a certain order in their words and actions, distinct from that of the objects and the impressions represented by them, all expression being subject to the laws of that from which it proceeds. But let us dismiss these more general considerations, which might involve an inquiry into the principles of society itself, and restrict our view to the manner in which the imagination is expressed upon its forms. So, now he gets into anthropology. Note this is entirely speculative, but it's rational, and it makes perfect sense based on everything that he said about the relation of words to primal feelings. He's going to say that children begin not with words but with noises and sounds. Early man likewise. So there's an analogy being drawn between childhood and adulthood, and early anthropology and adulthood. So they can't speak coherent words. How they know this? Who knows? It's a speculation. It's an analogy. It's an inference on the basis of experience from childhood. They don't know, and they grow to this. It's as I say, a projection in the past. In the youth of the world, men dance and sing and imitate natural objects, observing in those actions, as in all others, a certain rhythm or order. And although all men observe a similar, they observe not the same order in the motions of the dance, in the melody of the song, in the combinations of language, in the series of the imitations of natural objects. For there is a certain order or rhythm belonging to each of these classes of mimetic representation, from which the hearer and spectator receive an intenser and purer pleasure than from any other. But poets, or those who imagine and express this indestructible order, are not only the authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and painting. They are the institutors of laws and the founders of civil society and the inventors of the arts of life and the teachers who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world which is called religion. Hence all original religions are allegorical or susceptible of allegory, and like Janus, have a double face of false and true. Poets according to the circumstances of the age and nation. So he's giving an account of, remember Peacock's was, what was it called again? The 4 ages of poetry. He's accounting of 4 ages of human development himself. It's going to talk about different ages, and so here comes religion early on. You'll see this in anthropology, by the way. They'll talk about early man, and then religion comes about. And then comes the age of philosophy. And then comes the age of science, and finally comes the age of poetry, at least according to the Romantics. Those who are not Romantics are not going to they're not going to slip poetry in there. But they will be happy to talk about the move from the savage caveman to the age of religion as step one, and then philosophy comes in, Plato company, and then eventually science. Right? That's the account of anthropology. It goes upwards, and as we ascend higher, our minds have developed more and more, and we move further and further away from its origins. But Shelley is going to argue that poetry is there throughout. Poets are the architects of all these different ages. That's what's distinct about his argument. There isn't an age of poetry in the past, which was there with the religious poet. It was in every development of human society. Poets, according to the circumstances of the age and nation in which they appeared, were called in the earlier epochs of the world legislators or prophets. A poet essentially comprises and unites both those characters. You're going to find that what Shelley defines as a poet is basically everything that we attribute worth to in human society is a poet. A poet did it. So Jesus is going to be a poet, by the way. And so is Plato. And so is Solon, the lawgiver. And so is pretty much every figure in human history that we want to attribute some contribution to human society as it develops. He's going to say it's actually the poets. We call them philosophers, we call them scientists, we call them religious figures, we call them legislators or politicians, but actually they're all poets. That's the gist of the argument, really. But he will go through different periods to demonstrate how that comes over the course of time. But he will say that Livy, Herodotus, Plutarch, Livy, these are all historians, were poets. And although the plan of these writers, especially that of Livy, restrained them from developing this faculty in its highest degree, they made copious and ample amends for their subjection by filling all the interstices of their subjects with living images. So anybody who creates a vivid impression or uses imagery is a poet. Jesus is also a poet, by the way. Why is Jesus a poet? You ever thought of that? Why is Jesus a poet? Well, maybe he never thought he was a poet. What he said was poetry, and then his followers wrote it down. And when they wrote it down, they misconstrued, or they didn't misconstrue it, but simply by writing it down, they moved away from its original vibrancy, because he talks about the mind as a coal that makes a certain impression. I should go to, problem is here. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give you famous quotes from the defense of poetry. Defense. A single word may be the spark of an inextinguishable thought. Again, the thought is the ground, not the word. A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination. So it's a feeling, it's a empathy, not just a sympathy, but an empathy. You inhabit the person of another person, because there's no distinction there anyway. It's just a linguistic thing. This is an act of the imagination. All the great men of the past had this imaginative power. Sorrow, terror, anguish, despair itself are often the chosen expressions of an approximation to the highest good. Our sympathy in tragic fiction depends on this principle. Tragedy delights by affording a shadow of the pleasure which exists in pain. This is the source also of the melancholy which is inseparable from the sweetest melody. The pleasure that is in sorrow is sweeter than the pleasure of pleasure itself. Anyway, there are countless lovely phrases here from this. It's actually full of memorable phrases. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. I think his little articulations, the little images he creates, are far more powerful than the theory. The theory, which is terrible and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Everything good is poetry. Poetry is history, poetry is philosophy, poetry is, jurisprudence, poetry is religion, everything's poetry. Everything good's poetry, and everything that isn't bad is not poetry. And it's reasoning then. It sees differences, and I'm saying that the imagination unifies all things, so then everything good is what I call poetry. And I'm being imaginative. If you disagree, it's because you're being rational. And you're just analyzing things too much. But the images that he uses are fantastic. So how about this? It were as wise to cast a violet into a crucible, which is what you use in experiments to cook up the chemicals and so forth in the Bunsen burner. It would be as wise to cast a violet into a crucible that you might discover the formal principle of its color and odor as seek to transfuse from one language into another the creations of a poet. Wonderfully put. Difficulty of translation. How can you capture the significant beauty? Anyway, it concludes with the most famous line of all, which is the very last one. A great way to end. If you're going to write an essay, end it with a bang. And he ends it with an absolute door-slamming bang. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations. For it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age. Poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislature of the world. Note there, I love this, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present. So they are actually always thinking not about the past, it's the future and it's casting it into the present, hence they're prophetic. It's always future looking. So this is it's a different way of, when I say it's mimetic, it's not mimetic of the past or of the world, it's mimetic of what will come.